Hello everyone, welcome back. So in part 1 we painted foundation layers for this beautiful peony, and now we're gonna continue building those colors and try to achieve the richness, saturation and texture of all these beautiful petals. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Watercolor. I'm a botanical watercolor artist and teacher, and here I'm sharing all the paintings that we do with my students on Patreon every month or on Skillshare. And yeah, so we were painting this beautiful peony. It's one of those slightly bigger projects that therefore it has a few parts. And so now I will show how to create those very beautiful textured petals, but also achieve the color saturation and richness and luminosity of all these beautiful purples and pinks. So I'm starting with this main big petal here, and I load my brush with color and I dab on the towel to take the excess off, because what we want to do is now the dry brush technique. So dry brush technique is watercolor painting method where a mostly dry brush is used to create broken, textured, uneven or simply very thin small brush strokes on the paper. The dry brush technique is particularly useful for capturing texture and fine details on plants and flowers, and in our case on those petals. So for this flower I'm going to be using a couple of different types of dry brush technique. Right now I am loading my brush, taking the water out, the excess water out, and I dry brush entire petal in a direction of a form with quite straight and longer brush strokes to create this beautiful texture. And at the very end, once we finish with all petals and this step, then we will be dry brushing with very tiny brush strokes and tiny brush, kinda like a finishing touch, smoothing the petals and the layers out. So it will be a slightly different thing, but essentially they are both dry brush techniques. So now what I'm doing is I dry brush entire surface, creating the texture, building the color, and then once I think I'm somewhere where I need to be, I water down my mixes and I use glazing technique over my dry brush. So in that way I tone down the highlights, I build the color that I mentioned, but also I soften those dry brush marks and they appear a little bit more natural and realistic. So what is glazing technique? Glazing technique in watercolor painting is layering thin translucent washes of color or over each other or any other layers to create depth, richness and luminosity, which is exactly what we're doing right now. This technique is often used for botanical watercolor paintings to create a sense of depth and dimensionality in paintings. So to use glazing technique in botanical watercolor painting, simply mix a watery color using lighter version of your dark colors or any other mixes, but they need to be sort of milky and watery, quite transparent and translucent, and apply a thin layer over your existing layers and let them dry completely before reapplying. You can repeat this process as many times as you want, but each time you need to let that layer dry completely, otherwise you risk ruining your painting or damaging the paper. So by layering translucent washes of color over each other, the glazing technique creates a luminous effect that is ideal for capturing the delicate beauty of botanical subjects. And so I repeat this step on all of my petals because I already have my foundation layer that we did with wet on wet. Then I dry brush entire surface with fairly light color. I don't want those brush strokes to be very strong because the texture is quite subtle and soft on those petals. Then I do the glazing all over the petal, and then I examine it again and do a little bit more dry brush if needed. So let's finish that step on all of the petals, and then I will show you what I meant when I say I do a little bit of different dry brush at the very end for the purpose of perfecting the lines, the glazes, and smoothing out the petals.
Different waves, different strands of life, primal codes, cryptic by design. We just flow, like two floating looks. The river's wild, there's no way to pose. And if you feel, you know what there's in store. Hold on tight, you're out for some fun. And if you think you know what fate's in store, embrace yourself for change. 'Cause who you are was never set in stone. And things go down with a magic of their own. And when you think you gotta figure it out, life has its way to drop you from the clouds. So we hang onto Rosmary things, trying to guess what tomorrow brings. But as it poured from Chicago, we used to say, oh, carpe diem, which means seize the day. 'Cause if you think you'll know what there's in store, hold on tight, you're out for some fun. And if you think you know what fate's in store, embrace yourself for change. 'Cause who you are was never set in stone. And when things go down with a magic of their own, and when you think you gotta figure out, life has its way to drop you from the clouds.
Right, so we've done the dry brushing and glazing, and now I'm picking up my regular dry brush, which is number 0 by Windsor&Newton series 7. And that type of dry brush I do on all of my paintings every single time. And that is the technique I use to, although because we did already dry brush on this flower, the glazes are quite smooth, but they're not always looking that smooth on other paintings when there were no dry brush involved yet. So I usually do this kind of dry brush at the very end. So with my smallest brush, with the tiniest brush strokes, dry paint, I dry brush entire surface that I painted, and filling in the tiniest little gaps in a glaze that I can see in order to create this very smooth appearance of glazes. So they look like airbrushed or like they've been drawn with pencils, and you can't see any watermarks or patches. So that's what I'm doing, perfecting all those glazes, filling in the gaps, darkening little parts where needed to be. So when I start painting, I focus on the petal as a whole. When I paint with wet on wet, then when I do the other dry brush and glazing, we narrowing our focus. But when I do this step, the last dry brush smoothing technique, I focus on the tiniest piece of petal, and I really focus on just capturing every single detail that I can. That's just the way I like doing things. Not everybody probably would enjoy this step because it's very time consuming, but for me that really transforms every painting. So whenever I think I ruined it, it didn't go well, or I had like marks or whatever, I'm not happy with my painting. Usually if I push through that stage and I get to the stage where I start dry brushing, I sort of fix all my mistakes. So I really do love it, and for me it's just meditation and purely relaxing process. Often get questions, how do I achieve those glazes and transitions so smooth and seamless? And I probably can say that is because of this particular technique, because sometimes in this case, because I already did a lot of dry brush, I got about 80-90% where I should be, and then I finished with this tiny brush strokes, the other 10-20%. But usually I finish to about maybe 70% of my painting, and then I finish off with the tiniest brush strokes and the dry brush. So it varies and it depends. Some paintings I have to use primarily like wet on wet technique, like I did with my tulips that I painted recently. So here's the last step. What I wanted to do is lift off a little bit of color off the edges here and there, just to give this oomph to the flower head. So I'm just rubbing gently an area with clean damp brush and then dabbing it with the kitchen towel to absorb the paint I just lifted. And you can see what a nice edge it gives, especially to that very dark petal. Of course, cleaning my little spill here, and that's it. So that was it for the flower head, and next time we're gonna be painting leaves and stem. So stay tuned, and I'll see you the next time. Bye bye.